is that the principle is one of the best ways of dealing with and transcending the pressures of modern life. So what is the 80-20 principle? The 80-20 principle asserts that a minority, a small number of causes, inputs, or effort usually lead to a majority of the results, outputs, or rewards. So most of the output results from a very small part of the causes or inputs. Taken literally, this means that, for example, 80% of what we achieve in our job comes from 20% of the time we spend. Thus, for all practical purposes, 4/5 of our effort, pretty much all of it really, is largely irrelevant. And this is contrary, of course, to what we normally expect. So the 80-20 principle states that there is an inbuilt imbalance between causes and results, inputs and outputs, effort and reward. A good benchmark for this imbalance is provided by this 80-20 relationship. A typical pattern will show that 80% of outputs result from 20% of inputs, 80% of consequences flow from 20% of causes, or 80% of results come from 20% of effort. In business, many examples of the 80-20 principle have been validated. 20% of products usually account for about 80% of dollar sales. So do 20% of customers. 20% of products or customers usually account also for 80% of an organization's profits. In society, 20% of thieves usually make off with 80% of the loot. 20% of incompetent motorists will cause 80% of accidents, and even 20% of those who marry comprise 80% of the divorce statistics. 20% of children will attain probably 80% of educational qualifications available. In our homes, about 20% of our carpets are likely to get 80% of the wear, 20% of your clothes are likely to be worn 80% of the time, and if you have an intruder alarm, probably 80% of the false alarms will be set off by 20% of the possible causes. The automobile, the internal combustion engine, is a great tribute to the 80-20 principle. 80% of the energy is wasted in combustion and only 20% gets to the wheels, and this 20% is responsible for 100% of the output. The 80-20 principle tells us that in any population, some things are likely to be very much more important than others. A good benchmark or hypothesis is that 80% of these results or outputs flow from 20% of causes, and sometimes from a very much smaller proportion of powerful forces. I recently counted the top cities in England, and I found that the largest 53 cities had 25,793,036 people living in them. I didn't count the individual people, obviously taken from the census statistics. The next largest 210 conurbations had 6,539,772. If you do the math, you find that this is a terrifyingly precise 80-20 relationship. 20.2% of the cities have 79.8% of the people. Take another example. Studies consistently show that 20% of customers lead to more than 80% of profits for a firm. For example, the Toronto-based Royal Bank of Canada recently worked out how much profit each of their customers gave them, and they were staggered to learn that 17% of customers yielded 93% of profits. The 80-20 principle works everywhere in life. It's surprising, it's amazing, it's not what we expect. There is this big imbalance between causes on the one hand and results on the other hand. Most causes have little results, but a few transform life. Now, these statistics are evidence that the 80-20 principle works, and I could give many other examples of how it works. You might ask yourself, well, why should I care? What influence does that have on my daily life? The answer is that if you realize that a small proportion of the things that influence you and that you influence are going to be responsible for the results, you can achieve the results you want by identifying those very powerful causes. Things that you do, things that other people do, resources that you can get hold of. And if you actually use the very, very powerful forces for the purposes that you want, you can achieve much more with much less effort. That's the whole idea. You focus on the 20% that really delivers the results, and then you can basically relax, use those 20%, use more of those 20%, and not worry about the great mass of trivial reality around you. That's the whole idea, that you get more from less, that you get more results from less input, less time.